1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Welcome everyone to the April meeting of the Foxboro Historical Society. As is customary, before we begin our meeting, I would ask you to join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. So once again, we're very grateful to Foxboro Cable Access for hosting tonight's speaker. I should point out that our next meeting on May 25th will also be hosted by the Foxboro Cable Access. The locations for our full meetings are tentatively scheduled for the Boyden Library, but depending on the pandemic status. I would now like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Mr. Don Wilding. Don is well known to many in Foxboro as a past sports columnist for the Foxboro Reporter and as an author and authority on Cape Cod seafaring history. Any questions you may have for Don after the presentation can be communicated as outlined in our newsletter. With that said, I'll turn it over to Don. Don?
Thank you. Thanks. It's great to be back here. Last time I was in Foxboro on a regular basis, it was for covering sports. Well, now I'm coming in with shipwrecks instead. So this is my third book, Shipwrecks of Cape Cod. You'll be seeing it on your screen. And so I'll be going into the various some of the various chapters. I'll also touch on a couple of shipwrecks that I mentioned in two of my other books, Henry Beston's Cape Cod and A Brief History of Eastham. So Cape Cod's outer beach, this is where all these shipwrecks have occurred, and Cape Cod was always kind of a hot spot for shipwrecks. A lot of what I'll talk about here tonight will focus on shipwrecks that happened between the 1800s, the mid-1800s, up until about all the way to 1984. But there were even shipwrecks before then. Between 1626 and the mid-20th century, there were the 40 miles of the Outer Cape saw the demise of between 3,000 and 4,000 shipwrecks. So, and that was with the benefits of the Lifesaving Service and the Coast Guard. It could have been a lot worse without that. If all these wrecks had been raised, it's been said that one could walk from Provincetown to Chatham without getting his or her feet wet. And the one who recognized the Cape had a big problem, and that lighthouses were first needed, was Benjamin Franklin. And through his efforts, there was the first lighthouse was put up at Highland Light in Truro in 1797. And more lighthouses followed after that. 2 beacons in Chatham in 1817. Race Point in Provincetown followed very shortly after that. And then the 3 Sisters of Nauset in Eastham in 1837, and then even more followed afterwards. Generally recognized as the first Cape Cod shipwreck was the Sparrowhawk. There were other wrecks that happened before then, but it was generally recognized as the Sparrowhawk being the first. December 17th, 1626, is when this occurred. The Sparrowhawk was sailing from England, headed for Virginia, and was blown off course, ended up running aground in the area of Pleasant Bay. And Pleasant Bay, for those of you who don't know it, is located in the southern part of Orleans and right above Chatham. And this was right before Christmas in 1626. The English explorers actually were in quite a lot of trouble. They were actually rescued and assisted by some of the local natives, Nausets and other tribes that lived in the area. And when they were first approached by these natives, they were quite surprised to see that one of them spoke English and asked if they were among Governor Bradford's men. And they didn't know of him, so they actually assisted these people in getting their ship together. It wrecked again, though, in another storm that followed, and they actually had to go, they were actually taken to Plymouth and stayed there until the following spring when they were finally able to leave for Virginia. One of the great warships of the American Revolution was the British had was the HMS Somerset. Crew of 480 perished on the outer bar of Provincetown in 1778. The Somerset was pretty well known for terrorizing the outer Cape, some of the particularly Provincetown. It was also mentioned in the Ride of Paul Revere, but in Provincetown, people were scared of it. I mean, this was something that was causing a great deal of distress. They were the Captain George Ory was known to be was particularly frightening to a lot of people, especially to children. They would use that story to scare their kids into behaving, or the evil Captain Ory would come and get them. And Ory would also send his chaplain ashore and tell the people how wicked it was and unchristian it was to cherish any rebellious feelings against King George. So finally, during a storm, the Somerset is chasing a French vessel out on the ocean during a storm, and it runs aground. And this is when it hit a sandbar and off of the back shore of Provincetown. And people were actually watching on High Pole Hill, which is where the Pilgrim Monument stands today. And they saw this actually happen. And so they were ready to just go out there after the tide receded, and they actually walked right out because they were able. A lot of the men had either died during the stranding or were severely disabled. So they walked out and took all these British soldiers prisoner and took them to Boston eventually. They used Captain Ory in a prisoner exchange, but it was a pretty impressive gain for the Americans at that point. The remains of the ship were exposed again in 1886, and then not again until 1973, and more recently 2012. If you ever go through the dunes of Provincetown, you can actually see them if you're lucky at low tide, if it ever becomes visible again. You would have to go out on the area known as Snail Road off of Route 6, all the way to the ocean, and then several hundred yards to the left when you reach the ocean. So that's about the easiest way to reach it. And it's a very long hike, and it's very hard. Getting into some of the other more recent fatalities in disasters, the Truro gale of October 1841 is probably regarded as one of the most serious storms that ever hit the Outer Cape, and particularly the town of Truro. 57 men perished during that storm. And it was between the Truro Highlands and Chatham, there were about 40 vessels that ran aground during this storm. So they ended up finding about 50 bodies, while Truro lost all these men, 57. Dennis lost 26. 10 from Yarmouth perished, and 18 vessels from Harwich were also wrecked. Not too many of the vessels that were at sea were successful in getting back. Most of them perished. The Garnet was one of the few that managed to stay afloat. 2 days at sea, crew members finally found some potatoes floating in the water after 2 days at sea, and they actually were able to cook that meal before a Liverpool vessel that was captained by John Collins of Truro. saw their distress flag and rescued them. So that storm is, there's a monument that recognizes all the people that died during that storm in the Congregational Church of Truro, which is on the bay side of town. This shipwreck is not in the new book. It was in my previous book, A Brief History of Eastham. The British brig Margaret was stranded on Nauset Beach in 1852, started a whole line of a family on the Outer Cape, the Fulchers. Freeman Doe and Mayo was walking the beach after this storm, looking for any shipwrecks and anybody that might have survived, and he found one. Turned out to be a young 14-year-old boy, an English fellow named John Fulcher, and he was up in the rigging of one of these ships that had hit the bar. And that's what men aboard the ships would do. They would actually climb aboard. They would have to get up in the rigging and hope that they could stay alive until help came. A lot of times they didn't. It didn't happen. Fulcher was serving as an apprentice, and he was rescued by Mayo, and he ended up living in Eastham with 3 different families, and later became a U.S. citizen, and then he later owned farmland. If you've ever been in Eastham at Fort Hill, he owned a lot of farmland around there. And the family members from the Fulchers, they're still there today. You can, they would refer to the old MacDonald song when it came to the Fulchers, when they got to the 2nd and 3rd generation of Fulchers. There were so many of them around town, they would sing the tune to that song, Old John Fulcher came ashore, here a Fulcher, there a Fulcher, everywhere a Fulcher, Fulcher. Obed Fulcher had a farm. In 1854, there was a unusual set of circumstances. 7 men died when this unknown brig was swept across Massachusetts Bay and it struck the rocks at Scituate along the south shore. But there was a survivor, but it wasn't a human survivor. They had been watching this ship from ashore, and what had happened before the ship got into the bay, it had some things swept off its deck by the rough surf. Well, it turns out one of them was a pig that was inside of a crate, and the crate broke open, and the pig was actually able to swim to shore, and a little out of breath, but he made it there intact. And somebody in Truro found him on the beach right near Highland Light, took him home, and it was said he grew to be a big and lusty porker. And they also said if he could have talked, we would have known the name of the ship. But they never found that out. If you've ever gone to South Orleans and you've seen the Church of the Holy Spirit in South Orleans off of Route 28, that's got quite a history to it. It goes back to January 1857. The wreck of the Orissa occurred, and this happened after 4 men had died during this shipwreck, and the captain of the Orissa, Cyrus Sears, he was one of them who was taken to Captain Linnell's home in Orleans. And it was here that a lifelong friendship began between Cyrus Sears and Captain Linnell's newborn daughter, who was born only a few hours before the wreck. And they took into account everything that the Orissa had been through, and they named the girl for the ship, and they also gave her the name of the ship's captain as a middle name. So she was Orissa Sears Linnell. And that still lives on at the Church of the Holy Spirit. A Methodist priest lived there, Richard Kimball, and his wife Florence. That was built from a couple of different structures. It was built from the old Higgins Tavern, which is known for Henry David Thoreau stopping by there in 1849. It was also part of the Chequasit Neck Inn Wellfleet, which had been wrecked in a storm. They took part of that, and from the galley of the Orissa. The Kimballs called the house Galley West, and so it was made up, and that is still there today. So it's if you ever go to that church, you can actually see what is actually part of an old ship. And parts of shipwrecks actually did become parts of structures later on, washing ashore like that. Before the Lifesaving Service was established in 1872, there weren't too many people that were available to help out anybody that was in a shipwreck. You basically had to get volunteers together. Not an easy thing to do on the Cape because there weren't too many people living there in the first place in those days. The Mass Humane Society was started by some Boston people in the 1700s, and that actually served as a volunteer group that would rescue or try to rescue people that were involved in shipwrecks. They had their own surf boats and stations in some parts along the Cape, but in this case you kind of get what you pay for. It was just volunteers, and they weren't able to keep up with the demand. There were so many shipwrecks going on that they really couldn't do much. So this led to the formation of the United States Lifesaving Service, formerly happened in 1872. And this became, this was actually a formal organization of the government from the Treasury Department. At that point, they had the government appointed Sumner Kimball. He was a Maine native, but he had taught as a young man in Orleans. So he saw a lot of these shipwrecks firsthand. And he was appointed as the chief of the Treasury Department's Revenue Marine Division in 1871, and ended up becoming the first superintendent of the newly formed Lifesaving Service. He then later oversaw the merger of the Revenue Cutters Division with the Lifesaving Service, and that became part of the Coast Guard in 1915. Kimball was pretty much the ultimate bureaucrat. He knew what he was doing. He hired a PR guy he was an author, named William O'Connor. And O'Connor would write these reports that would exaggerate the facts from all of the Lifesaving Service keepers' reports. But he would exaggerate it and keep the facts. So this would in turn be very useful in getting money from Congress. And so when Kimball went for appropriations, he was usually successful because of O'Connor's vivid descriptions and such. And it ended up that Kimball was the first to retire with a pension, and it was said these were written to be read, and Kimball certainly got his money. Because back in those days, not a lot of people, nobody in the Lifesaving Service was getting a pension. Once you retired or were forced out of, if you were injured on the job or anything, you were done. There was nothing that could be done for you. So eventually, they opened up 9 stations along the outer beach of Cape Cod, all the way from Woodend and Provincetown down to the tip of Monomoy Island. Gradually, over the next few years, expanded to 13. It was at Woodend, Race Point, the very treacherous area off of Provincetown known as the Peaked Hill Bars, the High Head Life-Saving Station. The remnants of that are still able to be seen in the dunes of Truro. The Highland area had a life-saving station just up. If you've ever heard of Coast Guard Beach in Truro, that's where their Coast Guard station was. Pamet River down near Ballston Beach. The Cahoon Hollow Station in Wellfleet, better known today as the Beachcomber nightclub. The Nauset Life-Saving Station, and there's kind of a story behind that. It's the original station is not what you see there today. That was a station that was built later on in the 1930s. Orleans had a station down right near Pleasant Bay where the Sparrowhawk wrecked. And Old Harbor Life-Saving Station in Chatham, that's now located in Provincetown, and that's a story in itself. and Chatham had one near the lighthouse, and also Monomoy and Monomoy Point. So you had all these different locations. And the Lifesaving Service would send, they had probably 7 or 8 men at each station, along with a keeper who was the captain, the guy in charge. And the surfmen would be sent out to patrol the beach in both directions. They would go out on foot, carrying a lantern, usually at night, stormy weather especially, and keep an eye out for ships that were in trouble. And they would, in between these stations, would be these halfway houses, these tiny little shacks that had just a place where there was a telephone, and also places where they could check in with each other. They would check the men from, say, from the Nauset station would be going north. He would meet up with the Cahoon's Hollow man coming from, who was traveling south. And they had these small tokens that they would leave there to signal that, yes, we had done the patrol. So if it was number 1, you were a high-ranking surfman. If you were number 7, you were at the bottom of the totem pole. You probably had only been working there 1 or 2 years, and your previous experience with the sea might have been as a fisherman. They would often pull some of the equipment that they needed on a cart like this. Sometimes just the men would do it. Later on, they would also put the surf boats that were often used in rescue attempts if the sea wasn't too rough. And that was usually the case. If they did see a vessel in trouble, the surfmen would light a Castagna signal. This was like a flare. And this would signal the people out at sea who were in trouble that help was coming. It also signaled back to their station. So the men who were on watch at the station could see that, yes, there was a ship in trouble, and they would end up taking the appropriate measures after that. Sometimes instead of the men pulling it, they later had tractors when it became the Coast Guard, but they often had to rely on a horse, or even the men had to do it themselves. If they weren't able to use a surf boat to get out to the ships in trouble, they would have to use various forms of small cannons. The most popular type was called the Lyle gun. And that was this small cannon you see to your left there. And they would use these projectiles that you see stacked up in the center there. And the projectile would be tied to a very long rope, which would go almost 500 yards. And it would be wrapped up in a small box that was known as a faking box. And they would get as close as they could, shoot the projectile and the line out into the masts. And this would take several attempts sometimes. But they often would do it. And it created sort of a zip line from the ship back to the shore. And they were able to rescue a lot of people this way. They would also do drills with this during the week. It was one of the many drills they had to do. And proficiency was an absolute must in these drills. When they went to set it up, the best crews, they could fire the Lyle gun, rig a breeches buoy, and haul a person down from a wreck pole in 2 minutes and 30 seconds. This was during the drill. And if you had 5 minutes to get it done, and if you weren't able to do it within 5 minutes, that was cause for a dismissal. So now with the Lifesaving Service in place, it was established, but they were still building some of these stations along the beach. And this they were still kind of doing the rescues the old-fashioned way at this point. So right around Christmas in 1872, it was sort of a double whammy that happened near Head of the Meadow Beach in Truro. The Francis was the first of the 2 vessels they'd basically been sailing from India together. The Francis was the first one, this German bark, and the entire crew survived. They were all rescued. The captain, unfortunately, did not, but it was because of illness. He didn't die because of what had happened with the shipwreck. The Francis was carrying a lot of sugar, and Edward Worthen, who was appointed the Highland station keeper, he was one of them who had no station yet and no crew. So he had to organize, like a lot of the Humane Society people would do, a crew of local volunteers. They had to go all the way over to the bayside during a snowstorm, find an old whaleboat near a frozen pond, dragged it across the pond, put it on wheels, and went through deep snow all the way from the bayside to the ocean side during a storm. They were able to use this surf boat to get out there and rescue these men from the Francis. Unfortunately, the captain, he was sick, and he died shortly after the rescue at the Highland House right near Highland Light. And he was buried nearby in the cemetery right near Route 6. That's now across from the Truro Police Department. And during that time, after he was buried, Worthen still tended to his grave for over 30 years. So that just shows you the dedication. And these men took this hard whenever somebody died on their watch, even if it wasn't because of the shipwreck. They never liked to have this happen. The Francis, to this day, the remains of it still emerge at low tide. If you ever go out to head of the Meadow Beach in Truro, sometimes these old timbers are visible. So the Francis had a pretty good outcome overall compared to that of the Peruvian, which was also sailing on that same night. This ship was carrying sugar, rubber, and block tin from India to Boston. And this one ended up hitting a little further north at those horrible Peaked Hill bars. That's about a mile off the shore of Provincetown. And 22 men were aboard, including the captain. They all died. One of them being the captain, Zinavana. This was his final voyage at sea. And he was going to be returning to Boston, and his fiancée was waiting there for him. He was only 28 years old. And unfortunately, his fiancée found out the news by reading a headline in the newspaper. That's how she found out about his death. She opened up, saw the giant, great black, cruel headline that read, "Ship Peruvian goes down off Cape Cod. All hands lost." The Jason may have been one of the most tragic of all of the shipwrecks that occurred. In Truro, near the Pamet River Station, 26 men on board, 25 of them died because they had unfortunately climbed up into the masts after the ship struck the bar. And this ship had been at sea for 10 months. It was carrying 10,000 bales of jute, which was used to make fabrics. And they had already barely survived a cyclone in the Indian Ocean. So when it hit Truro, this was really bad when it hit the sandbar. Storm was raging. The men all climbed into the masts. One of them was knocked down. He didn't make it into the masts, and then he was washed overboard. Well, that was to his good fortune. That was Samuel Evans. He ended up being the only survivor because all of his shipmates were up in the mizzenmast, and when it fell, they all died. And he's not wearing hardly anything at this point. He washed up on the beach because he was able to clutch onto a jute bale and floated onto shore. And fortunately, the Lifesaving Service people came along just at the right time and found him on the beach, and they were able to bring him back to the station and basically got him back just in time. This is like a day or two after the wreck occurred, and he was from England, and he eventually went back home And his father wrote a letter to the Lifesaving Service saying, "Thank you, he'll be sailing from England again. I trust on a more favorable voyage." Well, Evans returned to England, shipped out on another vessel, and he died, but because he fell out of his bunk and broke his neck after surviving that whole tragedy with the Jason. He ends up going that way instead. Another tragedy that happened in 1896, the Monte Tabor was heading for Boston from Italy. This one was carrying salt, and it hit the Picket Hill bars during a storm. And a lot of this happened during stormy weather because you had to go around the Cape. You didn't have the Cape Cod Canal in a lot of instances in those days. It wasn't until almost World War I that the canal was built. So in this particular instance, the captain and crew and 2 crew members who were distraught over the incident took their own lives. 6 men out of the crew of 12 survived the tragedy. It was explained by the Italian consul that in Boston that it was an unwritten law among Italians that an army general on the battlefield by an act of his own hand rather than live to acknowledge defeat. And that same reasoning applied to the commander of a vessel. And so that was what the reasoning they came to. The captain had actually gone among his men, said saluta to all of them, and then he and the 2 men went into their cabin and took their own lives. The captain shot himself, and the other 2 men used knives to cut their throats. Meanwhile, the rest of the men washed ashore. And they could barely speak English, and they floated ashore on some of the remnants of the ship. And once they got to shore, they were rescued by the men from the Lifesaving Service. Well, again, they couldn't speak English very well, but once the story got to the sheriff in Provincetown, he was a little suspicious. He thought that this was not a case of suicide. He thought it was a mutiny, and ended up arresting the surviving men and put them in jail. So they spent the night in jail, and then eventually they were released. They were cleared and sent back to Italy. Well, still, this ended up being quite a gory story, made for some pretty sensational headlines in the newspapers as well. But when it came to one of the most tragic things that ever happened, it's probably hard to top what happened with the Portland Gale of 1898. This is not included in my new book. I'm working on this for a future project. But the Portland Gale was described as, on November 26th, 1898, it was a night to try men's souls. It was a night when the strongest of men trembled and when women wept. It was a night that should witness deeds of human bravery. It was a night of agony and of death. It was a night when the Coast Guardsman was remembered. It was remembered because nearly just under 500 people died during this storm at sea. Almost 200 of them were aboard the steamer Portland, which was leaving Boston that night. This was an early headline from the Boston Globe. They had suspected it was only 125 a couple of days after the storm. And we get a better look at the map here. It left Boston 7 o'clock on the night of Saturday, November 26, 1898. It was heading to Portland. It was carrying a shipload of people who had been celebrating Thanksgiving in Boston. Well, they should have never left, really, because their destination was Portland, and a storm was beginning at this point. And the captain, it depends on who you ask, but supposedly defied orders not to leave. And he had this shipload of people, and as it left Boston, it began to snow, and the storm got way worse than anybody had anticipated. It was one of these bombogenesis type of weather events. And up on the North Shore, just off of Gloucester, it really started to get into trouble. And nobody really knows what happened to it. But this map shows that it probably started to lose control. The captain lost control of it, and it started to blow out to sea because the winds had shifted to the northwest. And then during the night, it blew it all the way down towards Cape Cod. And for the longest time, nobody knew what had happened to the Portland. Eventually, they did figure out that it went down somewhere around Stellwagen Bay, and they eventually found the wreckage many years later. Hollis Blanchard was the captain. A lot of people thought he was being careless. There were other people who thought he was always too careful, and he had been reprimanded for that at one point. But whatever the case, almost 200 people died, and a lot of these bodies started washing the shore along the Cape's beaches. And a lot of that was in the area of Nauset, also up around Truro and Provincetown. They told tales of the carting of bodies to the railroad station and the relatives waiting anxiously in the Cape towns for their loved ones to turn up. Other vessels had also been wrecked offshore or on beaches during this storm, and their wreckage was all over the beaches of the Outer Cape. I wrote about this for the Cape Codder back in, I think it was 2015, 2016, and I got a response a few days later from a gentleman who said, my great-grandmother talked about the Portland when I was young. She told of the bodies found on the beach in Eastham. The funeral home on Bridge Road in South Eastham was full. The ground was frozen because this was a huge winter storm that had hit. So they kept a lot of the bodies in the barn behind her uncle's house. This is how bad it got. There were so many bodies that were just turning up. A lot of vessels were unaccounted for. The Pentagoet, another steamer. The Albert Butler ran aground off of Provincetown's back shore. The King Philip, schooner completely disappeared. And if you looked out onto Provincetown Harbor, usually that's a very tranquil area. Not so during the Portland gale. There were vessels, a couple of dozen vessels that had piled up in the harbor there. They ended up having to retrieve frozen bodies off of the Lester A. Lewis and Jordan L. Mott vessels. And a woman was watching from her windows in Provincetown while men cut frozen bodies off the Mott's rigging. And from that time on, she kept the shades drawn on every one of her windows that were facing the harbor. On to another disaster that happened a few years later in 1902, the Monomoy disaster. If you've ever gone down to the Chatham Lighthouse, there's what's called the William Mack Memorial. And this memorial is there because of the people who died on board these two barges, the Wadena and the Fitzpatrick. They had stranded off of Monomoy Point in Shovelful Shoal during this storm. They were actually being pretty careless about the whole thing. These were coal barges. And the Wadena ended up getting itself in so much trouble, or thought it was in so much trouble, it flew a distress signal. And when the distress signal is flown, the Lifesaving Service had to respond. So in this case, the keeper, Marshall Eldridge, and 6 of his crew members had to attempt a very ill-advised rescue. And on the return journey, a wave hit the lifeboat as they were doing this. And it didn't help that the crew members were panicking. And the boat kept collapsing and capsizing. And eventually, the only one left was surfman Seth Ellis. He was the only survivor left. And he was rescued by a dory that was manned by Elmer Mayo, who had been aboard the Fitzpatrick barge. Mayo got to Ellis, pulled him to his dory, got him to shore through some really, really heavy surf. And Mayo became known as the hero of Monomoy, got all kinds of medals from the Humane Society. They had a fundraiser in Boston for both men that both men went to. It helped raise over $36,000 for families of the men lost in the disaster. A lot of them were from Chatham and Harwich. Both of these men, incidentally, ended up dying just 2 months apart and much later in 1935. Ellis ended up being awarded a gold life-saving medal. He was promoted to keeper, held that position for a few years. And the Lifesaving Service came to the conclusion that, yes, there was bravery here, but this was not necessary. They didn't have to go and do it. But at the time, the distress signal was flown, so they actually had to respond to the call. Many years ago, if you've ever went up to the Highland Links at Highland Light, the golf course there was this old house that served as sort of a clubhouse there. And it was an old deck house from a barge. And it had a pilot house, bridge, and steering wheel. Well, this came from the wreck of the barge Coleraine. This happened in 1915. This month in 1915, the Mars was a tugboat. It ended up having to cut its barges loose. And all three of these barges ran aground on Troro's Outer Beach near Highland Light. Well, the Tunnel Ridge and the Coleraine were so badly damaged, they couldn't really do much with them, except for the Colerane's deck house. That was the only thing that really was able to be used for anything. It was not worth any attempt to float them. The Mannheim was the only one that's sustained any kind of minimal damage, and they eventually refloated it a year later. But the other two, they ended up burning on the beach of Truro. But they talked about it years later. Isaac Small, who was a well-known Cape Cod writer and keeper at Highland Light, he talked about how they got it up onto the cliff from the beach. And these cliffs, if you've ever seen them in Truro, they're almost 100 feet high. And he said, we cut it in two and ran it up on the cliff on skids, which is how it got there. And it was there for several years, but by the 1950s, it was gone. This, I thought, was one of the most interesting stories of shipwrecks that I came upon. I wrote about, I think it was 42 shipwrecks for this new book. This one, I thought, was one of the more interesting stories. The Castagna was an Italian vessel that ran aground near the old Marconi wireless station in Wellfleet. This was in February of 1914. Hit the sandbar during a storm, really horrible storm. It was carrying bull horns, cattle horns, and a load of guano, which was used to make fertilizer. They were heading to the Bradley Fertilizer Company of Weymouth. And this place was out on an island where even its workers lived there. I can't imagine this was a very pleasant place to live or work. And then again, I can't imagine that being aboard the Castagna was a very pleasant experience either. Because the Castagna had come from South America and was heading, and it was winter here, but it was summer down there. And they were headed up over the equator, and then they got north and they hit the winter weather. And that's when things started to really go wrong, and that's when it got into all kinds of trouble and then hit the sandbar in Wellfleet. 2 stations were involved in the rescue. The Nauset Station, led by Abbott Walker, who's on the right there, and the Cahoon's Hollow Station in Wellfleet. These 2 crews teamed up to attempt to get the men off this ship. Leading the charge was from the Nauset Station, Lewis Collins, the first #1 surfman, and his son Bernard, or Bernie. Bernie was only 17 years old when he took part in this. He and his father used to he went with his father to a lot of wrecks. You can see him here in this picture, the little tyke to the left of that surf boat. That was Bernie when he was a kid. So he would go with his father to these wrecks. Well, he went with his father to this one, and they discovered men that were frozen in the rigging. And they couldn't even get out to it. They tried to use a breeches buoy. The men were too frozen. And eventually the surf boat was utilized, but by then it was too late to save a lot of the men on board. 5 men were lost, either frozen to death up in the rigging, or the captain was washed overboard, and his body didn't turn up for another year and a half. And they found his body still well preserved, frozen, still partially frozen too, in Nauset Marsh, 10 miles away. So that tells you he was probably buried in sand for a very long time. But anyway, the men that Bernie found on board were stuck in the masts. Many of them were dead. They were described as looking like frozen mummies. And Bernie also had to cut a man off of who was grabbing a hold of the ship's wheel box, and his hand was frozen to one of the spokes. Bernie had to cut the spoke with an axe just to free the man. And by the time they got him to the beach and tried to get him to safety, he died. So this was kind of these kind of horrible things that Bernie at 17 saw, and the experience left him the frostbite and everything damaged for life, really. He was still experiencing it many years later. There were a couple of survivors, namely also in the cabin, namely a canary that was in its cage, still singing, but later died, and Castagna the cat. He was 100%. They brought him to shore, and he went to live at the Marconi wireless station for many years after that, rumored to start a very long line of cats on the outer Cape. The Annie L. Spindler was a rum runner that ran aground off of Race Point, carrying 600 cases of whiskey. This was in many different years after the fact. The Spindler was carrying a lot of illegal rum during Prohibition, and they ended up having to the Coast Guard confiscated it, but then the captain said, hey, I have papers that say I'm okay. I'm a British vessel. You can't touch me. So they ended up having to give it back to him. And they had to bring it over to Provincetown Harbor, put it in a new ship. And he said he was taking it to the West Indies. He ended up taking it to Plymouth. Henry Beston of the Outermost House fame, he was also tied up with a lot of shipwrecks. He mentions them in the book. Even one of the early covers of the Outermost House had that shipwreck feel. He was friendly with members of the Coast Guard. And he wrote an early article 5 years before the Outermost House called The Wardens of Cape Cod. And this actually, a lot of these items ended up in the Outermost House later on. He described in the Outermost House the wreck of the Pioneer, a ship that caught fire at sea, and a lot of the men were brought ashore to his little house on the beach. And I write about this in my book, Henry Beston's Cape Cod. Beston also wrote about the wreck of the Montclair, which was a schooner that wrecked at Orleans on Nauset Beach, broke up in an hour. 5 men drowned. And this was a lot of this happened because the Orleans station was horribly understaffed. They were going to close it. And there were only 3 men on duty. So 2 men survived. They were carrying bundles of laths to New York from Nova Scotia. And later on, they ended up reopening that station because of this disaster. The 2 men in the middle, in that group picture there on the left, one of them ended up coming back to Cape Cod in the 1960s after he saw a picture of the Montclair shipwreck in a feature by National Geographic magazine on the Cape Cod National Seashore. The Cape Ann 1948. This happened at Nauset Light Beach, just north of the light. Ice-covered vessel. It was a scalloper from from New Bedford. Fortunately, everybody survived, and even with it in the water, the cook was standing in waist-deep water cooking eggs. One of the crew members was a survivor from World War II, had been taken prisoner of war, and he was on 4 carriers that were torpedoed. So he had seen his share of disaster. And metropolitan papers, radio newscasters, they were all over the drama of this one. Out in Provincetown in 1960, the Monica Smith was a huge freighter that went ashore. It was during the middle of the winter, but it ended up drawing all kinds of people to Provincetown. Big boon to Cape End business. Provincetown restaurants ran out of food. You couldn't buy film anywhere on the Outer Cape. You had to go to Orleans just to get that, and lots of photographs turned up. I was fortunate to get a few of them. And it was suggested, let's open a Swedish restaurant on board with it sitting there. Well, they eventually were able to free the vessel. And it was even asked about, they brought aboard a big bag of linguiça from Provincetown in a grocery box to the ship. And it was asked, I wonder how he explained what that was in Swedish. One of the guys who was serving as a translator. Bernie Weber, who was famous for his role in the Pendleton rescue. I didn't touch on that in this book, but Bernie Weber was also involved in the very last breeches buoy rescue in 1962 for the Margaret Rose off Provincetown, where they were able to successfully rescue 7 men off of a vessel. In 1907, the Onondaga was a huge freighter that had beached itself. And later on, another huge freighter beached itself. Some of you might remember this. In 1984, the Eldea, right in the same area where the Sparrowhawk had stranded in 1626. The Eldea was struggling offshore on the end of March 1984. It was 471 feet long, and it took a huge Coast Guard rescue helicopter to do the rescue. And they were fortunate that they were able to do it because, one, they were running out of fuel. They had, in 60-mile-an-hour winds, they made 3 attempts. They took 8, 13, and 2 crew hands, respectively. And they were also running out of fuel at that point. If they hadn't gotten the 13 men off during the second run, they never would have gotten them off at all. And eventually, thanks to some really tricky cable work and tugboat work, the Eldea was finally refloated and towed through the Cape Cod Canal to Newport, Rhode Island, for evaluation. That first weekend, it was about 30,000 people went across the dunes to see the ship. And this was in the middle of, some of our guys are waving at that. It also translated into some really big business in Orleans. You had Noel Bile from Eastham who sold 20,000 postcards. Another lady from Orleans sold over 3,000 Eldea coffee mugs. And John Murphy from the Land Ho in Orleans, he told the Cape Codder business was better than on a rainy Saturday in July. If you ordered the clam chowder, you found a plastic freighter floating atop the potatoes. He said, I think everybody benefited from it, except the fellow who owns that ship. So what manner of men were these hardy specimens to have chosen the livelihood they did? Earl Rich said they were, in my opinion, the last of a breed. Come hell or high water, with utter disregard for their own safety, the safety of a shipwrecked sailor clinging to the rigging came above all else to them. Very quickly, these are some of my upcoming events. I'll talk about the Portland Gale on May 12th for the Eldridge Library online. And then this program will be done online June 2nd for the Newton Free Library, and also for the Nauset Fellowship Chapel in the Pines in Eastham on July 11th, and hopefully in person on August 23rd for Tales of Cape Cod. My website's dwcapecod.com. And my Shipwrecks book is coming out May 24th. So that brings my presentation to an end. I guess we have a few minutes. I think some people have been coming through on Zoom maybe, and others by email. Do we have anything?
No, apparently not.
Okay, well, we'll, like I said, dwcapecod.com. Also, we have links at Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram as well.
Don, I thank you very much indeed. That was terrific. And
Thank you.
It's just amazing the bravery of these folks. Like you say, many of them, they had no benefits if they were injured or killed. They were just injured or killed. It's sobering to think about.
Yeah, the pay wasn't great either. I
No.
mean, it was somewhere between $40 and $60 a month when you're looking at. So,
Well, once again, I thank you very, very much.
thank you.
was
Great to be
wonderful.
back here.
Thank you. We do hope you will. Thank you.
Very good, Don.
Once upon a time, Don, I was asked, why did they shut the stations down during the summertime?
Oh,
Right.
yeah.
Very easy question to answer.
No need for them, really. They kept a keeper and one of the surfmen on during the summer, and that was it. Other than that, no.